What most people misunderstand about empaths is that their greatest gift is also their most dangerous weapon. We live in a world that romanticizes empaths. We call them healers, light workers. The ones who feel everything so deeply that they cry at strangers' pain and carry burdens that were never theirs to hold. But here's what nobody tells you. An empath who has been broken enough times doesn't stay soft. They evolve. They learn to read rooms before they enter them. They sense your intentions before you've spoken a word. They know when you're lying, not because they studied you, but because they felt the shift in your energy before your mouth even opened. And the truly dangerous part, they rarely show it. An empath who has been hurt enough becomes a silent observer, patient, calculated. They don't react, they watch. And while you think you're controlling the conversation, they've already mapped every exit, every motive, and every version of who you really are. This is not a warning against empaths. This is a warning to never mistake their kindness for weakness. Because behind those gentle eyes lives someone who understands human nature more deeply than most people ever will. Be careful. Not because they'll hurt you, but because they'll see you completely. And you may not be ready for that. Most people think empaths are just sensitive. They picture someone who cries at movies, who feels overwhelmed in crowded places, who needs extra time alone to recover from social gatherings. And yes, those things can be true. But when people stop there, when they reduce an empath to someone who simply feels a lot, they completely miss what is actually happening beneath the surface. Because sensitivity is just the entry point. What lives underneath it is something far more complex, far more precise, and frankly, far more powerful than most people are prepared to understand. An empath doesn't just feel emotions, they decode them. When you walk into a room, most people notice what you're wearing, how you look, whether you seem friendly or distant. An empath notices something different. They notice the tension in your jaw that you think you're hiding. They notice the slight delay before your smile appears, that half-second gap that tells them the smile was constructed, not felt. They notice the way your energy changes when certain topics come up, even when your words stay perfectly calm and controlled. They're not doing this consciously at first. It starts as a feeling, a subtle pull in the chest, a quiet inner voice that says something doesn't quite match. And because empaths have spent their entire lives swimming in the emotional undercurrents of every room they've ever entered, they've built an internal database that most people don't even know exists. Think about what that actually means. Every conversation an empath has ever had, every person who has ever lied to them, every moment where what someone said didn't match what that person felt, all of it gets stored. Not in the mind as a logical record, but in the body as a felt memory. Empaths don't just remember what happened, they remember how it felt. And over time, those felt memories become a kind of radar system that operates below the level of conscious thought. This is why empaths often know things they cannot explain. They'll tell you something felt off about a person before anything went wrong. They'll describe a sense of unease in a relationship long before the betrayal becomes visible. They'll pull back from someone without being able to give you a clean, logical reason, and months later, you'll see exactly why their instincts were right. People sometimes call this intuition, and that word is fine, but it undersells the mechanics of what's actually happening. This isn't magic. This is pattern recognition operating at a speed and depth that the conscious mind cannot keep up with. The empath's nervous system has been trained, through years of emotional experience, to catch signals that other people simply are not wired to detect. And here is where it starts to become something you should pay attention to. When an empath walks into a space, they don't just read the surface of what's happening, they feel the undercurrent. They sense the unspoken tension between two people who are pretending everything is fine. They pick up on the shift in energy when someone in the room feels threatened or ashamed or hungry for control. They can feel the difference between a group that is genuinely at ease and a group that is performing ease for social reasons. You cannot fake your way through a real conversation with an empath who has learned to trust what they feel. And most people don't realize this because empaths are often quiet about what they perceive. They don't announce it. They don't say, I can tell you're not being honest right now. They simply file it away. They adjust their behavior accordingly. They make mental notes that they never read out loud. And while you believe you've successfully managed the impression you're making, the empath sitting across from you has already built a detailed and accurate picture of who you actually are beneath the version you're presenting. That is not a small thing. That is an extraordinary form of intelligence. One that doesn't show up on any standardized test, one that doesn't get celebrated in boardrooms or academic institutions, but one that gives empaths a window into human nature that most people will spend their entire lives trying to access through books and theories and frameworks. Now consider this. Most people move through the world trusting their conscious perception of others. They hear words and they respond to words. They see behavior and they interpret behavior. But they are largely operating on the surface layer of human interaction, the layer where people perform, present, manage, and construct. Empaths don't live on that layer. They live in the layer underneath, where the real emotional truth is always leaking through, no matter how carefully someone tries to contain it. Because the human body cannot lie the way the human mind can. The nervous system betrays what the words conceal. The micro-expressions flash before the controlled face can reassert itself. The energy in the room shifts before anyone has said a single word, and the empath feels all of it. Now imagine what that does to a person over the course of a lifetime. Imagine growing up in a world where you are constantly receiving information that other people aren't receiving or aren't acknowledging. Imagine knowing something is wrong and being told you're overreacting. Imagine feeling the emotional truth of a situation and being gaslit into believing your perception is the problem. Imagine absorbing the grief, the anger, anxiety, the loneliness of every person around you, often without anyone ever asking whether you had the capacity to carry it. That is the lived experience of a deeply sensitive empath. And it does something to a person. It doesn't break them, or at least it doesn't only break them, it also builds something in them. It builds a level of psychological awareness that goes far beyond what most people develop. Because when you've spent years having your perception dismissed, you learn to trust it more fiercely, quietly, and privately than ever before. When you've been deceived by people you opened yourself up to completely, you develop a kind of internal lie detector that becomes almost impossible to fool. When you've absorbed so much of other people's emotional reality, you develop an almost encyclopedic understanding of how human beings behave when they're afraid, when they're ashamed, when they're performing confidence they don't feel, when they're telling you what you want to hear instead of what is true. And here's the part that most people never consider. An empath who has done their inner work, who has learned to process what they feel without being consumed by it, who has developed boundaries without losing their sensitivity, who has stopped taking responsibility for emotions that were never theirs to carry, that empath becomes something remarkably rare in this world. They become someone who can see you, not the version of you that you've carefully constructed for public consumption. Not the confident mask, not the casual deflection, not the rehearsed story about who you are and where you're going. They see the version of you that exists underneath all of that. The part that's uncertain, the part that's still healing, the part that wants things you haven't admitted wanting, the part that's afraid of things you haven't acknowledged yet. And they do this without effort, without interrogation, without needing you to confess a single thing. That is the hidden power of the empath. Not their warmth, though their warmth is real. Not their compassion, though their compassion runs deeper than most people will ever understand. The real power is the perception. The ability to see through the noise and the performance and the social theatre and touch something true about who another person actually is. So the next time you meet someone who seems deeply sensitive, someone who listens more than they speak, someone who seems quietly tuned into everything happening around them, understand that their stillness is not emptiness. It is attention. It is the accumulated intelligence of 1,000 felt experiences, all working together in real time, building a picture of you that is more accurate than anything you've consciously chosen to show. You are not just being heard, you are being read completely, precisely, and without a single word being spoken. There is a version of an empath that most people never talk about. Not the one who cries easily, not the one who overwhelms themselves trying to save everyone around them. Not the soft, open, endlessly giving version that gets romanticized in every article you've ever read about highly sensitive people. There is another version, and it is built in the dark. It is built in the moments after the betrayal, in the silence after someone you trusted completely showed you exactly who they were. In the long nights when you replayed every conversation, every sign you missed, every moment you overrode your instincts because you wanted to believe the best in someone who was never going to deserve it. That version of the empath is not broken, it is forged. And the people who underestimate what that process creates are making one of the most significant errors in judgment they will ever make about another human being. Here is what actually happens when an empath gets hurt enough times. In the beginning, the empath operates from a place of radical openness. They lead with trust. They extend warmth before it's been earned. They assume good intent as a default position because that is how they experience the world, through connection, through feeling, through the deep and genuine belief that people are fundamentally worthy of being met with compassion. This is not naivety, it is a philosophy, a way of moving through the world that reflects something true and valuable about who they are. But then life happens, someone takes that openness and uses it. Someone looks at the empath's capacity for understanding and decides it is a resource to extract rather than a gift being offered. Someone stays close not because they value the connection, but because the empath's warmth is comfortable, useful, and easy to consume without reciprocating. And the empath feels it happening. They feel it before they can name it. There is that familiar quiet pull in the chest, the signal their nervous system has been sending them for years, telling them something is off. But they override it. Because they are wired toward compassion, they extend the benefit of the doubt. They tell themselves they're being too sensitive. They convince themselves that the discomfort they're feeling is their own issue to work through, not a legitimate warning about the person in front of them. So they stay. They give more. They try harder, and eventually the truth becomes undeniable. The moment of clarity when it finally arrives is not dramatic for most empaths. It doesn't come with screaming or rage or a clean Hollywood confrontation. It comes quietly, like a door closing inside them, softly, firmly, permanently. And that is when the transformation begins. Because what happens next is not what most people expect. The empath does not fall apart. They do not become cold or cruel. They do not decide that the world is evil and that people cannot be trusted. Those would all be emotional reactions, and the empath, for perhaps the first time in their life, moves past the emotional reaction into something far more grounded. They get clear. Painful clarity is still clarity, and clarity for an empath becomes the foundation of something entirely new. They begin to understand with a precision they never had before exactly how the dynamic worked. They see the patterns. They identify the mechanisms. They trace the ways their own openness was mapped and used by someone who understood them well enough to exploit them. This understanding does not make them bitter, it makes them literate. They become fluent in a language they never wanted to learn, the language of manipulation, of subtle coercion, of the small and consistent ways people take without giving, push without acknowledging, and drain without refilling. And once you are fluent in that language, you cannot become illiterate again. You simply start reading everything more carefully. This is the shift that most people on the outside completely miss. They see the empath pull back and they assume something has been lost. They think the warmth has been replaced by coldness, that the openness has curdled into suspicion, that the person they once knew has somehow become less than what they were. They mourn the version of the empath that gave endlessly and never asked for anything back. What they don't understand is that the empath hasn't shrunk. They have expanded, but inward. They have taken all of that extraordinary perceptual capacity that once flowed outward toward everyone, and they have redirected a significant portion of it towards something they previously neglected almost entirely: themselves. For the first time, perhaps, the empath begins to apply to their own life the same level of attention and discernment they have always applied to others. They start asking questions they were too busy giving to ask before. Who is actually safe? Who earns increasing closeness over time versus who only gets comfortable and then starts taking more? Who shows up consistently, not just when they need something? Who can hold space for the empath the way the empath has always held space for everyone else? These questions are not cynical. They are necessary. And the answers begin to restructure everything. Who gets access, how much, under what conditions, and for how long? The empath builds, often for the first time, a genuine internal architecture for their relationships. Not walls exactly, but something more like gates. And the gates don't open automatically anymore. They open for people who have demonstrated, through consistent behavior over real time, that they can be trusted with what lives on the other side. This is what gets mistaken for coldness. It is not coldness, it is discernment. And there is an enormous difference between the two. A cold person closes themselves off from everyone uniformly without discrimination because they've decided people are not worth the risk. A discerning person remains fully open to genuine connection. They simply require that it be genuine before they extend the full depth of what they carry. That standard, which might seem basic to most people, is revolutionary for an empath who spent years extending depth before it was earned. And now consider what this transformed empath actually becomes. They retain every gift they were born with: the perception, the ability to read emotional truth, the sensitivity to what is unspoken in a room, the capacity to understand human nature at a level that most people never reach. None of that goes away. If anything, it deepens because they are no longer spending so much of their energy absorbing other people's emotional debris. But now those gifts operate inside a framework of hard-won wisdom. They know what manipulation feels like in the body before the mind is caught up. They recognize the architecture of certain dynamics, the love bombing, the gradual erosion, the reframing of their own perceptions, because they've lived inside those structures and mapped every room. They understand the psychology of people who seek out empaths specifically because they know that sensitivity can be converted into a resource. And they are no longer available to be consumed in that way. What makes this so significant is not just the personal protection it offers the empath. It is what it signals about who they have become. A person who has been through the breaking point and come out the other side with their sensitivity intact, but their discernment sharpened, that person carries a kind of authority that cannot be faked, purchased, or shortcut. It has to be earned the hard way, through loss, through the specific pain of caring deeply about someone who never intended to care for you in return, through the long and difficult process of separating what is genuinely yours from what you were manipulated into carrying. Very few people do that work completely. The empath, by nature and by necessity, tends to do it thoroughly, and what emerges from that process is not a damaged version of the person they used to be. What emerges is the most complete version of themselves they have ever been, someone who has walked through the fire of their own pain, understood exactly what burned them and why, and decided with full awareness to remain open to this world, but never again on terms that cost them themselves. That is not a person to be pitied. That is a person who has earned the right to be exactly who they are, and the quiet, unshakable certainty of someone who knows they can never be truly broken again. There is something that happens to an empath after they have been through enough. Something that people around them notice but rarely understand. They become quieter. Not sad quiet, not the kind of quiet that signals withdrawal or defeat. A different kind. A settled, watchful, deliberate quiet that makes certain people in the room instinctively uncomfortable without quite knowing why. That quiet is not emptiness. That quiet is a strategy. And it is one of the most powerful things an evolved empath ever develops. To understand why, you have to go back to who the empath was before this shift happened. Before the breaking points, before the accumulated weight of too many one-sided relationships, before the slow and painful education that comes from giving everything to people who were never going to reciprocate, the empath reacted. They felt something and they responded to it, often immediately, often openly, often at great cost to themselves. Someone was hurting and the empath moved toward them. Someone seemed to need rescuing and the empath stepped forward. Someone pushed and the empath explained themselves, justified themselves, tried harder, and gave more. The feeling came and the response followed almost automatically, because that is what it means to be wired for emotional attunement before you have learned to govern it. Reaction was the default. Openness was the default. Engagement was the default. And people learned to rely on that. Some of them learned to exploit it. They learned that if they created a certain emotional climate around the empath would respond in predictable ways. Push here and they explain. Withdraw there and they pursue. Create confusion and they work to resolve it. Create guilt and they absorb it. The empath's responsiveness, which was rooted in something genuine and good, became a mechanism that certain kinds of people could operate almost like a control panel. And the empath, for a long time, didn't see it. Because when you are inside a dynamic, reacting to it in real time, absorbing the emotional weight of it, you don't have the distance to see the shape of what is happening. You're too busy feeling it to observe it. That changes. There comes a point, different for every empath, but unmistakable when it arrives, where something inside them simply stops. Not breaks, stops. The automatic response mechanism that used to fire without pause begins to slow down. The impulse to explain, to pursue, to fix, to absorb, it rises and then for the first time is met with something new. A pause. That pause is everything. In that pause lives a question the empath has not always been able to ask in real time. What is actually happening here and do I need to respond to it right now? That question creates space. And in that space, the empath begins to see what was previously invisible to them. Not just what they feel, but what is causing the feeling. Not just what someone is saying, but what they are doing. Not just the surface of the interaction, but the structure beneath it. They begin to observe rather than react. And this is where the silence becomes a strategy. Because when you stop reacting, something very revealing happens. The people around you have to show you more of who they actually are. Think about what a reaction does in a dynamic. It gives the other person information. It tells them the push worked, the withdrawal was felt, the guilt landed where it was aimed. Your reaction is their feedback. It confirms for them whether their approach is achieving the intended effect. When the reaction stops, the feedback stops. And people who were relying on that feedback, consciously or not, begin to reveal themselves in the silence. They push harder because the usual response didn't come. They escalate because the lever they were pulling has suddenly stopped working. They shift tactics, trying different angles to provoke the response they were counting on. And in doing all of that, they show the empath with extraordinary clarity exactly what they were doing all along. The empath who has learned to be still simply watches this unfold. They don't announce what they see. They don't confront it prematurely. They don't give away the fact that they are observing, because the moment they do, the other person adjusts their performance. The evolved empath understands that silence is not just absence of noise. It is an information gathering tool of remarkable precision, and they have become very good at using it. This is what people misread as coldness. They were used to the empath who filled every silence, who smoothed over every tension, who worked overtime to keep the emotional temperature of a room comfortable for everyone, often at the expense of their own comfort. When that behavior stops, it can feel like something has been taken away. And in a sense, something has, but what has been taken away was never the empath's responsibility to provide in the first place. The stillness that replaces it is not an absence of care, it is the presence of discernment. The empath still feels everything. That has not changed and will not change. What has changed is what they do with what they feel. Where they once translated feeling directly into action, into words, into movement, into accommodation, they now let the feeling inform them without immediately driving them. They feel the pull to react, and they sit with it long enough to ask whether reacting serves them, whether it serves the relationship, whether it serves the truth of what is actually happening. Often they find that it does not. Often they find that the most powerful thing they can do is nothing. Not nothing in the sense of passivity or indifference, but nothing in the sense of refusing to participate in a dynamic that only functions because of their participation. Some interactions are engines that run entirely on the empath's responsiveness. Remove the fuel and the engine stops. And when the engine stops, you see it for what it is, a machine designed to produce a particular outcome, not a genuine exchange between two people. The empath sees this now. And the silence is how they hold that knowledge without tipping their hand. There is a particular kind of strength in being the person in the room who is most aware of what is happening and least compelled to demonstrate that awareness. It requires a quality that does not come naturally to people who feel as deeply as empaths do, the ability to hold a truth internally without immediately externalizing it, to know something without needing to say it, to see something without needing to react to it. This is a form of emotional self-governance that most people never fully develop. The empath develops it out of necessity, because they have learned, through direct and sometimes devastating experience, what it costs to externalize every feeling, to react to every provocation, to make themselves fully legible to people who have not earned that level of access. The cost is too high, and so they learn to hold themselves, to sit inside their own perception without immediately broadcasting it, to remain present and aware and fully engaged with what is happening around them, while revealing selectively, strategically, only what they have decided to reveal. This makes them paradoxically more powerful in the very interactions where they appear to be doing the least. Because silence, for someone who was once defined by their expressiveness, is not the absence of something, it is a statement, a boundary without words. A form of presence that communicates to anyone paying close enough attention that this person has moved to a different level. that they are no longer available to be steered, triggered, managed, or manipulated through their own emotions, that they see the game, and they have simply decided not to play it. The people who find this unsettling are usually the ones who relied on the empath's reactivity to maintain a particular kind of control. They preferred the expressive, responsive, endlessly accommodating version, not because they valued the empath, but because that version was predictable. It could be managed, it could be navigated. The quiet version cannot, and that is exactly the point. The silence of an evolved empath is not a wall they hide behind. It is a place of extraordinary clarity, awareness, and personal power, built not from hardness, but from the hard-won understanding that some things are worth feeling without performing. Some truths are worth knowing without announcing, and some battles are already won the moment you choose not to enter them. This is a direct message, not a metaphor, not a soft philosophical observation wrapped in comfortable language designed to make difficult truths easier to swallow. This is something that needs to be said plainly, clearly, and without the kind of careful cushioning that allows people to hear it without actually receiving it. If you have ever underestimated an empath, if you have ever looked at their gentleness and concluded it was weakness, looked at their patience and decided it was passivity, looked at their willingness to give and determined it was an unlimited resource you could draw from without accountability, then this is specifically for you. Pay attention. The empath in your life chose to be kind to you. Read that again slowly because the weight of it matters. They chose it. Every single time they extended warmth in your direction, every time they listened beyond the point where most people would have stopped, every time they gave you the benefit of the doubt when their instincts were already signaling caution, that was a decision, a conscious, deliberate act of will. It was not the absence of other options. This is the fundamental misunderstanding that people who exploit empaths consistently make. They interpret kindness as a fixed personality trait, something the empath cannot help but produce like a reflex, automatic and unconditional. They think the warmth just flows endlessly and regardless because that is simply what empaths do. And so they treat it as ambient, as background, as something that will always be there no matter what they put into the relationship in return. They are wrong. Kindness at the level an empath operates is not a reflex. It is a value that they actively live by. And like any value that is lived rather than merely stated, it requires something to sustain it. It requires a context in which it makes sense. A relationship in which it is at least occasionally met with something real. An environment that does not consistently punish generosity with exploitation or reward openness with manipulation. When that context is consistently absent, the value does not disappear, but its expression toward a specific person in a specific relationship absolutely can. And when an empath finally withdraws their kindness from someone who has spent months or years taking it for granted, the withdrawal is not impulsive. It is not emotional. It is not even in the way most people use the word angry. It is final, because here is what most people never understand about the moment an empath decides they are done. It does not arrive the way you might expect. It does not come in the middle of a heated argument. It does not announce itself with raised voices or dramatic exits. It comes quietly in a private moment, usually after the empath has already given the relationship more chances than it deserved, more grace than it earned, more of their interior life than was ever safe to extend. It comes when they realize, with a clarity that cannot be argued with, that nothing they do is going to change what this is. And in that moment, something shifts inside them that does not shift back. The door does not slam, it simply closes. And the empath, who has spent so much of their life pouring energy outward, redirects that energy inward and forward toward the people and pursuits that are actually worthy of what they carry. They do not spend significant time mourning the loss of a connection that was never truly reciprocal. They process it, they understand it, and then they release it with a completeness that can look, from the outside, almost unsettling, because you expected more reaction. You expected the empath to fight harder for the connection, to reach out, to explain how they feel, to try one more time. You expected them to behave the way they used to behave, emotionally available, endlessly patient, willing to absorb whatever you offered and continue extending what you were no longer returning. But that version of them was not who they always were. That was who they were before they understood what was happening. And now that they understand, they are someone different. Not colder. That distinction matters and deserves to be made clearly. They are not colder. They remain, in their core, deeply feeling people who are capable of extraordinary connection. But the connection they are now available for looks different from the outside. It is mutual, it is reciprocal, it is built on demonstrated respect rather than assumed goodwill. It requires that the person on the other side shows up with at least some fraction of the intentionality the empath brings. This is not a high bar for most healthy relationships. It is only a high bar for people who are relying on the empath's unconditional giving to compensate for their own consistent absence. And if you are one of those people, what you feel when the empath withdraws is something very specific. It is not just the loss of their company or their warmth or the practical ways they showed up in your life. What you feel is the sudden, disorienting absence of someone who truly saw you. And you may not have recognized while it was happening how rare that was. You may not have understood in real time what it actually meant to have someone in your life who felt your emotional reality as clearly as their own. Who knew when something was wrong before you said a word? Who created a space around them where you could be fully human, fully complex, fully imperfect, and still be met with understanding instead of judgment? Most people move through their entire lives without ever finding that in another person. You had it, and the way it ended was entirely determined by what you chose to do with it. Because the empaths saw that too. They saw exactly how you handled what they offered. They noticed every moment you consumed without contributing, every time you took the understanding they extended and used it to avoid accountability rather than grow toward it, every instance where their patience became in your hands a license to remain exactly as you were without consequence. They noticed. They always noticed. They simply cared enough for long enough to keep showing up anyway, until they didn't. And here is the truth that sits at the center of all of this. The thing that, if you hear nothing else, deserves to land somewhere permanent inside you. The empath did not leave because they stopped caring. People who do not care do not spend years extending grace to those who do not deserve it. People who do not care do not feel the weight of a relationship's failure the way an empath feels it. Thoroughly, deeply, in a way that takes real time and real work to process. People who do not care walk away easily, cleanly, without looking back. The empath looked back. They looked back many times. They questioned themselves. They wondered whether they were being too harsh, whether they were missing something, whether there was one more thing they could do or say or offer that might change the fundamental nature of what the relationship was. They did the work that should have been shared. And when they finally accepted that the work was never going to be shared, when they accepted that the dynamic was not going to change because the other person had no real incentive to change it, as long as the empath kept absorbing the cost, they made the only decision that was left to make. They chose themselves, not out of selfishness, out of survival, out of the hard-earned recognition that you cannot continue to pour from a vessel that is never refilled without eventually pouring out everything you are. So if you are sitting with the loss of an empath who once gave you everything and then disappeared from your life with a completeness that still confuses you, understand that their absence is not a mystery, it is a mirror. It reflects back with perfect accuracy exactly what you gave them when they were still there, exactly how you treated what was offered, exactly what you decided their kindness was worth. And the most important thing you can do now is not chase what is gone. It is to look honestly into that mirror and decide for the first time perhaps to become someone worthy of the kind of love an empath was always trying to give you.